My name is Robert Eaglestone. I am Professor of Contemporary Literature and Thought at Royal Holloway, University of London. I've written about the Holocaust, I've written about literature and philosophy, but I've also edited a book on Brexit and literature, and I'm writing a book about Brexit and literature, and it's an aspect of that book that I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon. And in order to do that, I've got a short PowerPoint which I'm going to share with you. What I really want to talk about is, so I'm going to end up talking about three novels, a best-selling novel, a kind of cult novel from the north of England, and a kind of literary Brexit novel. But before I talk about those, I want to set the scene a little bit by talking about some other ways, three ways of looking at Brexit and the kind of world of Brexit. One comes from the tradition of political science, quantitative political science, that's based on statistics and interviews. The second, in contrast to that, draws on the work of the German political thinker Hannah Arendt, and it draws on her political theory. And then, once I've established those kind of ideas, I'm going to talk about those ideas in three contemporary novels. So let's begin by talking about political science. So in 2021, quite an influential book came out, edited by Maria Sobolewska and Robert Ford, called Brexit. And it was, despite its title, Brexit Land, it was really a study of the British polity in the 20-teens, I suppose we call it. Maria Sobolewska and Robert Ford argued that the referendum wasn't so much a moment of creation, but a moment of awakening, when the social and political processes long underway finally became obvious, and the different groups of voters finally recognized themselves as two distinct and opposed camps. And they said UK had been shaped by two profound long-term changes: educational expansion and ethnic diversification. They talked about waves of university expansion since the 60s. In 1987, 8% of UK voters were graduates. By 2017, 24% were. And similarly, they say that within a single lifetime, the UK has changed from a nearly all-white society to a racially diverse one, page 27. The waves of migrants, they say, have had different impacts. While Commonwealth migrants and their descendants, they argue, could use the power of the ballot box, more recent EU migrants could not, which skews political debates towards those threatened by their arrival, they argue. Now, these two changes have led, they argue, to what they call ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, they say, while often quiescent, can easily be activated when ethnocentric voters perceive a threat, and is both uniquely capable of shifting white vote choices and shaping the voting decisions of those influenced by the experience of white hostility. There's one quite subtle but powerful illustration of this from Jonathan Coe's State of the Nation novel, Middle England. Greta, a Polish woman, is attacked in a shop for speaking Polish on her phone. Her formerly friendly and supportive employer, the English Mrs. Coleman, is a witness, but when asked to retell the story to the police, instead says to Greta, "I think on the whole, it would be better if you and your husband went home," not only refusing solidarity, but taking the side of the aggressor. Sobolewska and Robert Ford argue that this leads to a radical division in the British polity between what they call conviction liberals, necessity liberals, and identity conservatives. So conviction liberals are mostly younger graduates, cosmopolitan, pro-migration, embracing diversity and opposing ethnocentrism. Necessity liberals, they argue, are ethnic minorities for whom anti-racism and pro-diversity stances are not a matter of personal values but of necessity. And identity conservatives are, they say, formerly the unquestioned dominant group in Britain whose ethnocentric views define the mainstream. From their point of view, they go on to argue, it is society that has changed and left them behind. It's therefore no surprise that such voters tend to adopt a conservative stance. Change is perceived as a loss for ethnocentric voters, a loss of their dominant position, a loss of the cultural conformity and continuity they value. Ford and Sobolewska argue that this group's decline has been dramatic and the experience of this decline has been disorienting and disillusioning for them. Their view of losing position in power is not irrational, they argue, because this group shrinks, so the political incentive to respond to it also declines, particularly when it concerns conflict with the concerns of the rapidly rising liberal identity group. These groups live even in different spaces. And so Brexit land reveals, in terms of its statistical analysis, this division of the British state into these three groups. And this is supported by another study from 2021, Alyssa Henderson and Richard Wynne-Jones's Englishness, the political forces transforming Britain. There they analyse, to speak really quickly, a huge rise in what they call an English worldview, a worldview that is shaped, this is supported by their statistical work, a view that's shaped by grievances, is profoundly Eurosceptic and anti-devolution, has a veneration for the past and is a desire to preserve the past through institutions, and creates a kind of politicized English identity. And it hankers for a time in which they say an English-dominated Britain knew its proper elevated place in the world. And naturally, the rest of the world knew it too, a kind of imperial nostalgia. They go on to say that lest one believes, the people who are the most profoundly ethnocentric also feel most profoundly disenfranchised. The less one believes in inability to influence politics, the less voice one feels one has, the greater the appeal this particular vision of England as a political community. So we see here, in terms of these political science, quantitative arguments, a rise in ethnocentrism, in the idea of Englishness, and a polarization into three different groups. To that, we have added another factor of loneliness. So this comes from Marina Hertz's book, The Lonely Century from 2020, but is actually quite well established in an array of political writings. So loneliness, Hertz says, and she takes it from Hannah Arendt really, is both an internal state and an existential one, personal, social, economic and political. And she goes on to say that our current phase of capitalism, our neoliberal capitalism, leads people to feel isolated and alienated, disconnected both from their fellow citizens and from national governments who they feel have not been listening to them or looking after their interests. They talk about economic insecurity, precarious jobs, zero-hour contracts, what she calls rather politely negative politeness cultures. She's really thinking of kind of the rudeness and anger, I guess, of Twitter and of those and of the world in general, hostile social environments and the collapse of social institutions. In the UK, a third of youth clubs and nearly 800 public libraries have shut down since the 2008 financial crisis, along with 41% of adult day centres. And this loneliness, this destruction of the social bonds, creates loneliness, and we know that also destroys self-esteem. In contrast, she says that the populists offer a kind of belonging, a panacea, using the us and them kind of ethnocentrism, which I've just mentioned before. All these studies and the work they draw on offer a pretty grim picture of community in contemporary Britain. The English ethnocentric majority of identity conservatives are easily activated by right or far-right politicians, have a profound sense of grievance towards Europe, the other nations of the UK, and the so-called liberal elites. They feel unheard and politically inefficacious, and venerate the English past as a time when they mattered. More, with the communities destroyed by neoliberal policies, they feel lonely, isolated and disconnected from each other and the state, and again are very open to a kind of phantasmatic idea of belonging. In contrast, a small number of conviction and identity liberals, located mostly in cities, have a different world view. And between these polarized sides, there's friction and conflict over migration, race, national identity, devolution, and the sharing of national wealth. The actors in the contemporary culture wars both draw on and inflame these divisions. So that's the kind of political science version. And to that, I want to supplement a much more theoretical, philosophical approach offered by Hannah Arendt. And she talks a great deal in her great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, about loneliness, about uprootedness. And she thinks that indeed this loneliness is a key factor in the rise of a totalitarian regime. Regimes that run on terror need isolation, which prevents people working together. Little contacts between men, she says, are severed, and the human capacity for action and power are frustrated because we can only act in solidarity with each other. Isolation is a step towards loneliness. In isolation, people can still shape their world, make things, even if they can't act together. But loneliness is more extreme. It comes from uprootedness. It comes from our roots, our place in the world, our institutions being uprooted or destroyed. And she says these are, and from that, even worse, once you're uprooted, you can be made what she calls superfluous. And by superfluous, she means kind of unnecessary, unwanted, a kind of person who no one cares about or feels a need to care about. And she says these are the curse of the modern masses since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, made acute by the rise of imperialism and the breakdown of political institutions and social traditions in our own time. She goes on, to be uprooted means to have no place in the world, recognised and guaranteed by others. To be superfluous means not to belong to the world at all. So her argument is that this politicized loneliness, the collapse of our social institutions, the cement that holds us together, if you like, has leads to a highly polarized, highly atomized society. And what she calls the masses, she means something different from kind of Marx or people, that these lonely crowds of people grew out, she says, they grew out of the fragments of a highly atomized society whose competitive structure and concomitant loneliness individual that had been held in check only through membership in a class, in groups or organizations. The chief characteristic of the mass man is not brutality and backwardness, but his isolation and lack of normal social relationships. Coming from the class-ridden society of the nation-state, whose cracks have been cemented with nationalistic sentiment, it's only natural that these masses, in the first helplessness of their new experience, have tended towards an especially violent nationalism, which mass leaders have yielded against their own instincts and purposes for purely democratic reasons. Now, she's talking about Europe in the 20s and 30s, but what she says is clearly applicable to the UK in the last few years. And she goes on to contrast the state with a nation. And she talks about what she calls tribal nationalism. On the one hand, we have the state is a political organization which believes in the rule of law and defense of human rights, in which everybody is equal. There's a legal justice system. And on the other hand, the nation, which is a more nebulous sense of people, in which a specific national identity is important. And we haven't got to think very long about discourse in the last 5 years or so to think of the way in which judges, for example, were described as enemies of the people. For the state, I'm a human being. For the nation, I'm English or Scottish, and so on. The state's about equality in law, the nation about affect and feeling, belonging or not. Nationalism is, in normal times, as I said, the cement that holds the community of the nation state together. However, as society becomes increasingly fractured and polarized, nationalism becomes increasingly important, and more tribal nationalism emerges when the nation outgrows the state. Indeed, tribal nationalism is hostile to the state precisely because the state is set in contrast to or even against the nation or the tribe. Tribal nationalism is opposed to the state system of government itself, to parties and to the old system which it seeks to sweep away. Think of all those Brexiteers' demands to do things in a new kind of way. This hostility to the state is obvious in England, hostility to the EU, obviously, which Brexiteers see as a state, but also to the UK state and its institutions, the judiciary I've mentioned, the BBC, the universities, the media and Parliament. And this hostility arises regardless of what these institutions actually do. And we'll remember the strange situation where the ruling ethnocentric Conservative Party often sounded as if they were in opposition to the state as opposed to ruling it. When the Brexiteer Party starts saying, oh, all working people and we're not interested in different parties, okay, that's a very worrying sign. It's claiming to speak for a whole people and not for a political party. And after all, political parties are supposed to represent different aspects of the state, the workers or capital or so on. The tribal nationalists, the Brexiteers, understand the past only as myth. Okay, it's not actually interested in history. Think about the debates about stately homes and the uncovering of actual historical records about those being pushed to one side by groups interested only in the idea of the past as myth, and interested in the glorious past. Think of the way in which the memory of the Second World War is constantly deployed in Brexit discourse. And I think many people I'm talking to can think the Second World War was kind of great in films and on TV. But I remember, of course, my parents talking about being kids in bomb shelters, being, of course, absolutely terrified. So the Second World War, constantly referred to as a glorious past, is actually much more complicated. The present is always portrayed by tribal nationalists as a time of crisis and decline, and they portray a wonderful future. Remember the offerings of Empire 2.0 and Global Britain, which of course have come to less than nothing. These Brexiteer tribal nationalist parties, not interested in specific policies or in social questions. They hadn't, do you remember in the 2019 election, they didn't really have any policies. The Brexit Party didn't have a manifesto or anything like that. And they also, the idea that the tribal nationalists believe their tribe exceeds the state boundaries. So people talk often about the Anglosphere. And finally, because the tribal nationalists believe, as Arendt says, a Russian and a German are as different as a fox and a wolf, they deny a kind of common humanity, and that includes denying a kind of common sharing responsibility for the planet. So it doesn't surprise us that tribal nationalists are also deniers of the current eco-catastrophe. So I've talked about the polarized nature of the state. I've talked about ethnocentrism. I've talked about loneliness, and I've talked about tribal nationalism. And we'll see how all these four ideas weave their way through these three different novels that I'm going to discuss with you quite briefly. The first is a literary fiction from the home of new writing, granter, Sarah Moss's wonderful novel Ghost Wall. Sarah Moss is a really superb writer. I can't recommend her all her novels high enough. I'm going to talk particularly about Ghost Wall though. The second, so quite often novels are turned into graphic novels. This is I think the unique example of the other way round. Barney Farmer writes a strip for the best-selling comic Viz called Drunken Baker, and in 2018 he turned it into a rather remarkable cult novel, not from an established London press, but from a press, Wrecking Ball Press, based in Hull. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then the third kind of novel is a genre novel from a highly commercial publisher, HarperCollins, a kind of historical adventure novel you can buy at the supermarket. Bernard Cornwell's the last novel in his series called Warlord. So I'm going to take you through each of these novels, and we're going to see how these Brexit ideas that I've outlined emerge and re-emerge, and what they do with them. So to start with Ghost Wall, the novel begins with a short account of an Iron Age ritual sacrifice of a young woman. This is a kind of common theme actually in Sarah Moss's fiction. It's focalized through the victim, and it's a foreshadowing suggesting the roots and violence of contemporary tribalism. Now, most of the novel is told by Sylvie, who's set over a few summer days. Sylvie, who's a teenage girl, her mother and father, who's a bus driver, are with a university archaeologist and his students, Peter, Dan, and Molly, and they are undertaking what's called experiential archaeology. They are trying to live as Iron Age people from 2.5 millennia ago. Her father calls them the ancient British. In the present, they forage for food, wear tunics, cook over a fire pit, collect water, and sleep in a roundhouse. And the novel tells two interlocking stories. The first is Sylvie's increasing infatuation with Molly and desire to escape her violent father. She's caught between childhood and adulthood, between classes, and caught by her abusive father. Inspired and aroused by Molly swimming in the sea, Sylvie bathes in a stream and is seen by her father, who beats her with a belt. Yet she defends her father. When Molly expresses concern, "Haven't you been listening?" she says. "People don't bother to hurt what they don't love, to sacrifice it." The second story in the short novel is her father's increasing radicalization during the experiment. He's violent, lonely, resentful, and angry. He doesn't like it when people laugh. Racist, anti-Irish, anti-Catholic, foreigners coming over here telling us what to think. He's obsessed with belonging to the roots of Englishness. His daughter says he wanted his own ancestry, wanted a lineage, a claim on something, some tribe sprung from English soil. And significantly for him, the remains of ancient Britain are the same as those of the industrial age. Stopping off at Newcastle, he takes Sylvie not to the Roman Museum, but to the docks. Cranes reared above, like ceremonial pillars of lost civilizations, intricate with rust and disintegration. Look at this, he said. We used to send ships all over the world from here. Look at it now. This kind of scene, by the way, an older person mourning an abandoned industrial site, is now a cliche of what critic Christian Shaw calls Brexit. In Ghost Wall, this loss leads to anger, resentment, and violence. So it happens in Jonathan Coe's Middle England, a similar scene looking at industrial wasteland. And it's several novels have exactly an analogous scene. However, back to Ghost Wall. As the archaeology experiment goes on, the father becomes more extreme. At first, cooking only a kind of gruel, he hunts and then skins and makes the group eat rabbits. He beats his wife and daughter more, and finally, the men come to build the ghost wall of the title. The archaeologist explains how, as a last-ditch defense against the Romans, one of the tribes used magic and made a palisade and brought out their ancestral skulls and arranged them along the top, dead faces gazing down. Using the animal skulls, the men built such a wall. The rabbit palisade, thinks Sylvie dismissively. The men go on to have a ceremony, the professor drumming with his head thrown back to the moon, Dad sitting straight as if in church, joining a wordless chant. Eventually, the foreshadowed sacrifice. The father and the men decide to sacrifice Sylvie. They wanted to kill me at sunset, she says, as they reenact or reinvent the ritual that created the bog bodies. I'm not going to spoil the plot for you, so I'm not going to tell you anything more about what happens. But in contrast to her father's more racist, mythic history, Sylvie comes to her own ideas about the past. She does indulge herself with the idea that ancient knowledge somehow runs in our blood, but her realizations are more complex. So not mythic history, but a more informed, responsive kind of history. She imagines correctly the Roman army as multicultural, and she imagines the bog girl, a young teenager, Dad had said, about your age. She had a life before me, that bog girl. This allows her the crucial insight into the past and into her father, that the bog people Dad loved who could exist as victims, as the object of violence. For her father, they're both a sign of a past grandeur and the focus of resentment. They exist as destroyed, unheard, and disempowered, and he celebrates them as dead. But by contrast, Sylvie realizes the past is somehow in the present. The whole point of the experiment is that we ourselves became the ghosts, learning to walk the land as they did 2,000 years ago. And to do it properly, I thought, we almost have to absent ourselves from ourselves. And their point is to make the past live again in its kind of reality, not as myth, but as real history. In addition to this, the novel is clearly about class. So Sylvie and her dad and her mum are working class, and the students, the professor, of course, middle class. She even hears them talking about international holidays. The students haven't even heard of Burnley or Rochdale, where Sylvie's family come from, and while Molly has a posh southern accent, Sylvie's father is dismissive of the South as just traffic and throngs of people. The father lacks status, and Sylvie is aware that he resents those other men who are paid to walk the places Dad loved and write the ideas he could have had. So that's a novel about the past, about loneliness, about class, about lack of belonging, about myth, and about gendered violence. And we see some of those same aspects in Barney Farmer's Drunken Baker. Look, I'm a professor of English, so I'm talking about a novelization of a comic strip from Viz, and I want to say something really serious about it. Drunken Baker is a kind of utterly unpretentious, late modernist stream of consciousness novel, covering, I mean, that's how we would describe it in an English department, covering something like 12 hours in the life of a drunken baker, told by that baker in short, broken paragraphs, from his waking with a tot of rum to his all-day work with another, also drunken baker. It covers their whole day, and the story is a profoundly sad one. The bakery had been a success for generations, 3 generations. Customers, a line along the pavement, along the street, down past the bookies, down to the hairdressers. And factory workers too, in the evening at lunchtime. Half the blokes in the factory would be up here for our pies. But now it's more than precarious. As the northern town it's set in is falling apart, the bakery is past failing but still just about open. The baker's memory is dominated by his surrogate father, the gaffer, the baker who owned the bakery and trained him, and the gaffer's wife, Alice. The gaffer taught him all the tricks of the trade, all the tricks and craft his dad and granddad passed to him. He passed that to us, a chain of skill passing down through the generations. The town and the bakery are woven together. Bread of that family fed this town for 70 years. Alice, too, the gaffer's wife, tied the bakery into the whole community. She knew all the mums and wives and birds. But now the factories are closed, the town is dying, and the little pieces, little links are broke for good and all. The book, through the consciousness of this one baker, shows the interlinked communal, professional, and personal damage of this breakage. The baker's angry self-destructiveness is both a response to and a metaphor for this destruction. The whole community's collapsed. The pubs have gone. There might have been a fire in Old England, says the baker, but the protagonist replies, Old England's gone, every stone of it. Pub's been knocked down. There's a vicious circle. The bakers and others buy black market drink because the pubs are too expensive, which in turn leads to the pubs closing, which in turn leads to more black market drink, which, in an epitome of loneliness, is consumed alone and not convivially. Pubs and the bakery are the little links broken for good. Their bakery, the baker's professional craft and self-regard, has been destroyed by neoliberal capitalism. We can't compete with them shitty chains. 2 steak slices for £1, fucking quid, that's us fucked. And steak, get to fuck his steak. It's bleeding shit, bought by the ton, blasted off skeletons with a jet wash. The bread sold by these chains is inhuman. Frozen dough off an industrial estate 200 mile away, done by the bloody ton, all machines, no hands have been in it. And while the gaffer taught us never to cut a corner, not one, because you never know why people come back, now they have to cut a few corners to keep going. So one of the many strengths of this novel is the kind of detail about the corners that are cut. So this destruction is clear at the personal level too. The bakery itself is dysfunctional, as a dysfunctional community. It's a community of two bakers, and they hate each other. We never learn his or his colleague's name, only they call each other an extremely abusive term. The protagonist is also malicious and unpleasant. Both bakers steal from each other and trick each other. And finally, in a dream sequence, it's revealed the protagonist beat his ex-wife. I never done that, he says. I never done nothing like that. And that the other baker knows. We hear his personal decline from a professional young man meeting his wife to beat it the first time to a lonely, desperate, hate-filled alcoholic. So a model there of that kind of loneliness that Hannah Arendt was talking about, or Norma Hertz in her book about the lonely century, and its astonishing amount of damage. The way the personal loneliness and political loneliness are woven in together, and a sense of a destruction of communities. It's not a kind of angle you hear very much from cosmopolitan literary media. My last novel I'm going to talk about is Bernard Cornwell's Warlord. It's the final instalment in a best-selling historical adventure series, which in the words of the website tells the story of Alfred the Great and his descendants through the eyes of Uhtred, an English boy born into the aristocracy of 9th century Northumbria, captured by the Danes and taught the Vikings' way. It's a TV series called The Last Kingdom. So look, these books are narratively compelling, well crafted, if a little formulaic. Uhtred is known as the wicked, but in fact is quite good, loyal, oath-keeping, and a good and thoughtful master. Bernard Cornwell, who wrote the Sharp series that was on TV, these Last of England series have become more and more interested in Brexit without perhaps admitting it. They've become more and more about the idea of the nation, of nationality, of how to negotiate the stresses of the nation, as they tell a kind of epic story of, as it says in the quotation, what we have learned to call Inglalaland. So they're books about the foundation of England. And this final one, Warlord, concerns the Battle of Brunanburg in 937. I hadn't heard of it either, I'm ashamed to say, which Cornwell suggests is the founding battle for England. Before the battle, there was no England. As dusk fell on the bloody field, there was, because one king, Aethelstan, had united the warring kingdoms within England as one by his victory. Like many best-selling writers, Cornwell keeps his personal politics close to his chest. Indeed, when he's asked about Brexit on his website, he hedged his bets. I suspect it's probably an error, or else it's the first lifeboat off the Titanic, one or the other. So he doesn't want to piss off either sorts of readership, leavers or remainers. So he kind of hedges his bets. But the politics of the books are clear. They are an epic of national creation. In the novels afterward, Cornwell writes that the story of England's making is not well known, which strikes me as strange. And these novels make real that story. Cornwell says that I had to write a book about the creation of England. Most historical novels have a big story and a little story, and the big story is the true story. As an ethnocentric nationalist epic, it displays many of the qualities analysed by Ford and Sobolewska. Issues of race are dealt with in an interesting way. Uhtred's entourage is multiracial, comprising English, Irish, and Viking warriors. He may seem wicked, but he's not racist. More, he seems noticeably progressive in that, while disapproving of Christianity, he doesn't really mind people's religion. That said, he and the novel are profoundly ethnocentric. They're about belonging, allegiance, and the conflict between different ethnic groups. Uhtred and the others are firmly bound in place by oaths and ties of belonging. More, their identities are bound to a place. I am Northumbrian, and my life has been dedicated to regaining his castle, his Bamberg. So this novel and the series glamorizes and celebrates belonging in a clear, masculine, gendered way. So this is a nationalist history of the sort that Sylvie's father would approve of, complete with an undertow of male violence. You can see this sense of patrimony in this in the epilogue. I am Uhtred, son of Uhtred, who was the son of Uhtred. His father was also called Uhtred, and they were all Lord of Bamberg. I am that too, but these days folk call me Lord of the North. Though I am old, my task is to stop the Scots coming south to the land we have learned to call the England. Here the trains of patrimony, the ancestry and lineage is foregrounded. Little links have not fallen apart, but appear in a kind of consoling historical myth. And by myth, I don't mean these novels are not highly informed or don't draw on historical record. Rather, they offer a consoling, masculine, ethnocentric English nationalist story. No one here is lonely, but they live in a fantasy of a strong community. The recurring image of the novel is the shield wall, both terrifying and held onto as a model of courage, in which warriors stand and fight their enemies kind of face to face. So I'm going to finish up now in the last few minutes and say what threads link these novels to Brexit and the current state of the UK's community. First, none of these novels offers to speak for the whole community. They're not state of the nation novels. Indeed, such is the level of polarization revealed in the stats that perhaps no state of the nation novel is possible at the moment. There's nowhere outside the polarized conflict from which to speak. Jonathan Coe's Middle England has all the generic markers of the state of the nation novel. Characters drawn from across the state, fictionalized political reportage, real events recounted, and so on. But in the end, it wears its Remain heart on its sleeve and is part of this polarization. The three novels I've discussed reflect very different audiences. That said, each shows a community at war with itself, polarized by class and prosperity, region, ethnicity, and, barring a bloody battle, little sign of resolution. Oddly, it's the studies based on quantitative theories which suggest ways to solve our current situation. Populist opposition in Brexit land, more local democracy in Englishness, rebuilding the fibres of community in Hertz and Pullman. None of the novels suggest any solutions like this, but they do explore a nostalgia for a lost past of communal connection. Two remain very bleak. I'm not going to spoil the plot of Ghost Wall, but it doesn't offer a resolution. There's no way out for the Drunken Baker, and Warlord, for all its craft, is a consoling historical fantasy. So, none speak for the whole community. They're all quite bleak. Second, each are about concern for the past and manifest a powerful and painful nostalgia. Sylvie's lonely and violent father is the most extreme, the desire to root himself in the past and awareness of loss in which the whole past is run together. Cranes like the ceremonial pillars of lost civilization. The baker's memory of the thriving town community, the chain of generations, the bread that fed this town for 70 years is also painful. Both of these are the algia in nostalgia. So nostalgia, algia means a sickness. Algia means sickness. So these are the sickness. Warlord is both alive with these memories and is itself a response to them, offering a nationalist epic to kind of try and resolve these feelings in a phantasmal, imaginary way. Sylvie too feels this, half playfully imagining ancient knowledge in her blood, although she does not feel the need to belong so strongly. This is how ethnocentrism inhabits a past. Ones I've just mentioned lead to a third point, the gendered masculine nature of this painful nostalgia. The male establishment elite are filled, writes right-wing journalist Anne Applebaum in her savage Twilight of Democracy, filled with conservative nostalgia and a belief in the restoration of English greatness. These novels show the painful non-elite version of this nostalgia, which lacks any sense of restoration and instead is filled with self-hate, despair, victimization and destruction. There's a search for a male patrimony, the Gaffer, the ancient Britons, the fantasy constellation of the fortress owned by Uhtred's father and grandfather. This is so powerful in Ghostwall that it wins over the archaeologist and at least one of his male students, a gendered desire more powerful than class. It's tied as well to male violence against women. So to conclude, Arendt wrote of how the visible and invisible threads of society were severed, and Farmer's Baker says the little pieces, little links are broke for good and all. The past was not perhaps as golden as nostalgia paints it, but in its place, what's left appears to be a community totally ruptured and divided into profoundly opposed groups. Individuals lost to loneliness and despair, turning to destruction and violence, false hope and hollow belonging offered by dangerous people. The fiction that I've looked at, indeed a significant amount of British fiction in the last 3 or 4 years, is in the same vein. Some's escapist nostalgia, sure, which may console, but the images of the past it offers may suggest something worse. Some is filled with warnings, some filled with nothing but despair. Thank you.